The best console Sega ever built was also the last one it ever made. In the autumn of 1999, Sega launched a machine so far ahead of its time that it had a modem built inside it and a tiny screen set into the controller, and on its very first day, it sold so fast that it broke every record the industry had. 2.5 years later, it was dead, and Sega walked out of the console business forever. This is the story of the Dreamcast. This is Kilobyte Chronicles. To understand how a console this good could die this fast, you first have to understand what Sega had already done to itself. In the early 1990s, Sega was on top of the world. The Genesis had gone toe-to-toe with Nintendo and won over a whole generation with attitude, with speed, with a blue hedgehog who had personality. For a few incredible years, Sega did the unthinkable. It went to war with Nintendo, the giant that had owned the living room for a decade, and it actually won. The advertising was cocky. Sega does what Nintendo don't, the slogan went. Sonic was faster and cooler than Mario, and for a while the entire schoolyard agreed. Sega had clawed its way to roughly half of the American market and earned the kind of fierce loyalty most companies only dream about. And then, across about 5 years, Sega quietly took all of that goodwill apart. There was the 32X, a strange mushroom-shaped attachment that bolted onto the Genesis and went almost nowhere. There was the Sega CD. There was the Game Gear. Each one asked loyal fans to spend more money on hardware that Sega then abandoned soon after. But the deepest wound, the one that never really healed, was the Saturn. The Saturn was Sega's 32-bit console, and its American launch in 1995 is still taught as one of the worst in the history of the business. Sega had told everyone the machine would arrive in September. Then, at the very first E3, the big industry trade show, Sega's American chief walked out on stage and announced that the Saturn was not coming in September at all. It was already in stores. That very day, for $399. It was meant to sound like a triumph. It was a disaster. Only a handful of chosen retailers had been given consoles, so every store left off the list was furious, and one major chain was so insulted that it refused to sell a new Sega console ever again. Game developers, blindsided by the surprise, had almost nothing ready for shelves. It did not help that the Saturn never got a proper Sonic game of its own, the one thing that might have carried it. And then, at that very same show, Sony stepped up to reveal the price of its new PlayStation. Their executive walked to the microphone, said 2 words, $299, and walked off without another word, $100 cheaper. The room erupted. The Saturn never recovered. It sold fewer than 2 million units in America and limped to an early grave. So by the time the Dreamcast came along, Sega was not a beloved underdog anymore. It was the company that had burned its own fans 3 times in a row. And that is the first thing you have to hold on to about the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast didn't lose for being bad. It was born carrying a debt of broken trust that no machine, however brilliant, could ever fully repay. Which makes what Sega did next almost heroic. Instead of playing it safe, Sega bet the entire company on one last spectacular machine. The Dreamcast was powerful, yes, but more than that, it was strange in all the right ways. It came with a modem built right into the box, at a moment when almost nobody imagined sitting at home and playing games against strangers on the other side of the world. Sega's chairman, a quiet man named Isao Okawa, was convinced that online play was the future, and he pushed his teams to build for it years before the rest of the industry was ready. The console also shipped with a little memory card called the VMU, and that memory card had its very own small screen, so a corner of your game could ride around in your pocket. A screen inside the controller in 1999. You could raise a tiny digital pet on it, or carry a saved game across town to a friend's house, but the modem was the real gamble. Sega built an online service so that you could dial up, climb onto the internet, and play against people you had never met, in an age when most homes had a single screeching phone line and no clear idea what any of this was even for. It was a bet on a future that had not arrived yet, placed by a company that could not really afford to be wrong. But even a great machine needs someone to sell it, and here the story turns human. The executive who had brought the Dreamcast to America, a man named Bernie Stoller, was fired by Sega just weeks before the console was due to launch. The job of introducing it instead fell to a marketing leader named Peter Moore, who understood exactly what Sega was up against. Moore's team built the launch around the tagline, "It's thinking," along with a run of strange and striking commercials. Moore later said the goal was to intrigue people, to somewhat apologize for the past, and to remind everyone of the Sega they used to love. It was, in other words, a company trying to win back trust it had already thrown away. And for one glorious autumn, it actually worked. The Dreamcast launched in North America on September 9th, 1999, a date Sega turned into a battle cry. $99.99 for $199. It arrived with 18 games ready to play, among them a dazzling new Sonic adventure and a fighting game, Soul Calibur, so beautiful that people bought the whole console just to play that one title. Every machine came bundled with a playable taste of that new Sonic adventure, and for a little while, owning a Dreamcast felt like being let in on a secret. And the public responded in a way almost nobody had predicted. In its first 24 hours, the Dreamcast sold more than 225,000 units and took in $98 million. Peter Moore called it the biggest 24 hours in entertainment retail history, and he was not just puffing it up. Sega pointed out that the Dreamcast had earned more in a single day than the new Star Wars film had taken on its opening day that summer. Within 2 weeks, 500,000 machines were gone. By that Christmas, the Dreamcast held nearly a third of the entire American market. After years of losing, Sega was winning again, and for a few bright months it truly looked like the comeback might last. And the games for a while were extraordinary. Sega had grown up in the arcades, and it poured that arcade heritage straight into the Dreamcast. For most of the 1990s, Sega had quietly ruled the arcades, those loud, glowing halls full of machines that cost far more than anything you could ever put in a living room. The Dreamcast's real trick was that it could bring those arcade games home almost perfectly. At a time when the home version of an arcade hit was usually a blurry, watered-down imitation. For a certain kind of player, plugging in a Dreamcast and seeing a near-flawless copy of the game they had been feeding quarters into all year was a small miracle. Crazy Taxi let you tear through a sunlit city, hurling passengers toward their destinations for tips. Jet Set Radio invented a whole cel-shaded, spray-painted look that games are still copying to this day. There was Seaman, a genuinely bizarre game about raising a talking fish with a human face that spoke back to you through a microphone. There was the sweeping pirate adventure of Skies of Arcadia, and there was the online experiment the piece Okawa cared about most of all. It started small with a puzzle game called Choo Choo Rocket, the first Dreamcast game you could play over the internet. Then, in the year 2000, came Phantasy Star Online, which let players scattered across different countries team up and adventure together in real time. It was not, despite how fondly people remember it, a truly massive online world. Only a few players shared any single game. But nothing on a home console had ever really done this before, and for the people who logged in, it felt like the future quietly switching on. This was Sega at its absolute best. And the tragedy is that its best was arriving at the worst possible moment. Because then, one by one, the walls began to close in. The first was a shadow, and it was enormous. Sony had announced its next machine, the PlayStation 2, and the hype around it was unlike anything gaming had ever seen. The PlayStation 2 would not just play games, it would also play DVD movies, which in the year 2000 was still a genuinely expensive luxury, all on its own. Why buy a Dreamcast today, the thinking went, when you could wait a few months and get a games machine and a movie player in a single box? Millions of people decided to wait. And for the Dreamcast, waiting was fatal. You could feel it happening through the holiday season of 2000. The PlayStation 2 arrived, impossibly hard to find, sold out everywhere, the must-have machine of the year, and every headline about Sony was a headline that was not about Sega. The Dreamcast had not suddenly gotten worse. The whole world had simply turned its head to look at something else. The second wall was a betrayal by an old friend. Electronic Arts, the biggest maker of sports games in the world, the company behind Madden Football, told Sega it would support the Dreamcast, but only on one condition. It wanted the exclusive right to make sports games on the system. No competitors allowed. Sega said no, because Sega had just spent its own money buying a studio to make sports games of its own. So Electronic Arts walked away, and the Dreamcast launched without the single most popular sports series in America. For a huge slice of players, that absence alone was a deal breaker. The third wall was quieter and stranger. The Dreamcast used a special kind of disc, but through a loophole in the way it read those discs, someone worked out that the console could be tricked into playing games burned onto an ordinary blank CD with no special equipment at all. Piracy spread quickly. Why buy a game, some asked, when a copied one played just as well? People still argue about how much damage this really did, but it certainly did not help a company that was already bleeding money. And then there was Shenmue. Shenmue was Sega's masterpiece. an astonishingly ambitious adventure that tried to simulate an entire living town, right down to the weather and the daily routines of the people in it, and it was, at the time, one of the most expensive video games ever made, reportedly costing more than $70 million. That is something like $130 million in today's money. The trouble was the arithmetic. By one accounting, Sega would have needed to sell 2 copies of Shenmue for every single Dreamcast on the planet just to break even. That is not a business. That is a company spending its way toward the exit. And still the refrain holds. The Dreamcast didn't lose for being bad. It was drowning in troubles that had almost nothing to do with the quality of the machine itself. By the time the PlayStation 2 finally arrived, the Dreamcast's momentum was gone, and here the story turns unexpectedly tender. Isao Okawa, the chairman who had believed in the Dreamcast, who had believed in the whole online future it was straining toward, was by now an old and very ill man. He had already loaned Sega $500 million of his own money just to keep it breathing. And as he was dying, in the early months of 2001, he did something extraordinary. He forgave that debt. He handed back nearly $700 million worth of his own company stock so that Sega might survive whatever came next. He had spent the last of his energy not on saving the console, which he surely knew was already lost, but on saving the company that had built it. He died that March. And what came next was the end of the dream. The final decision fell to Peter Moore, and it was a brutal one. Sega discontinued the Dreamcast. The last consoles were cleared out of stores, marked down and marked down again, until they sold for less than $50 each. And Sega, the company that had once fought Nintendo to a standstill, the company that had defined the very attitude of an entire era of gaming, walked out of the hardware business it had lived in for 2 decades, and it never came back. From that day on, Sega would only make games for other companies' machines, including, in time, the very PlayStation that had beaten it. Strangely, that turned out to be a decent living. Freed from the ruinous cost of building its own consoles, Sega settled into a quieter life as a game publisher, and it is still with us today, which is more than you can say for a lot of the names in these stories. So, the Dreamcast failed. But look closely at what gaming became in the years right after it died. Every major console now comes with the internet built in, exactly the way the Dreamcast did at first. We download our games instead of driving to a store for them. We play against strangers across the whole world. We carry little pieces of our games around on second screens and phones. Sega's strange little machine tried all of it first and got almost none of the credit. Even its pioneering online world, the one people sometimes misremember as the first giant online universe, was not quite that, but it pointed straight at the way tens of millions of us would be playing a decade later. The Dreamcast lost the war and then quietly won the future it had dreamed up. It simply was not around as a console to enjoy the victory. The ironies stack up almost too neatly. Sonic the Hedgehog, the mascot Sega built to humble Nintendo, now cheerfully turns up on Nintendo machines and on the PlayStation and on the Xbox, on everything. The online console gaming the Dreamcast pioneered became one of the foundations of the modern industry, worth billions, cashed in mostly by the companies that came afterward, and the machine itself never really died in the hearts of the people who loved it. Devoted fans and small studios kept making brand new Dreamcast games for years and years after Sega had moved on, long past the point where it made any commercial sense at all. Shenmue, the game that had helped bankrupt the whole endeavor, had ended on a cliffhanger, and its fans waited the better part of 2 decades and then helped fund a sequel themselves, out of sheer stubborn love, just to see how the story ended. And maybe that is exactly why it is loved the way it is. The Dreamcast didn't lose for being bad. It lost for being too early and for being built by a company that had finally run out of second chances. It is the beautiful last word of a company that used to be dangerous. So here's my question for you, and this one is personal. Were you there on September 9th, 1999? Do you remember the first game you ever loaded onto a Dreamcast, or the friend down the street who had one, or the soft whir of that little disk drive spinning up for the very first time? Tell me about it in the comments below. Subscribe, and we will chronicle the next one together.